Thanks to Andy and to Lonnie and to the Teagle Foundation for the invitation to speak with you today about a couple of works that, though they might not be on your mind, are some of my very favorite works. Like Andy said, I haven't taught these texts, so I won't be telling you how I do teach them, but rather how I would or rather might. So I'm not sure how many of the participants today are familiar, but Purdue has recently rebranded its School of Management to become a School of Business, massive investment. And one of the great achievements of our administration in the College of Liberal Arts is that they've agreed to include the Cornerstone curriculum as part of the core curriculum of the new business school. And so if I were teaching these texts in the future, it would be in that context of a specialized Cornerstone program for business. But I think that they're worth thinking about teaching in ordinary Cornerstone contexts as well. I really think that they're rich, and that what you can do with them in the classroom is flexible and fun, and that you can get students thinking about some pretty cool ideas. Oh, yeah, there it is. So yeah, I was trying to figure out why my mouse wouldn't work to the slide. So in the first course of the two-course sequence for Cornerstone for Business, students read texts like Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics, Hobbes' Leviathan, Locke's Second Treatise, Smith's The Wealth of Nations and Theory of Moral Sentiments, and Dickens' Hard Times, as well as Marx's Communist Manifesto. And there are some other smaller texts as well that we have them reading. So I think what I'll do by way of starting here today is just to say a little bit about the narrative structure that I tend to have in mind when I'm teaching these texts. The narrative structure that I tend to like to use here depends on sandwiching Dickens between the two Smith texts. And so I'll take you through some passages that I think make that narrative structure compelling. So I think the first thing to do is to emphasize the really strong aspects of the Wealth of Nations. So that's the text that you start with, that emphasize most strongly one half of the paradox that's known to scholars of these texts as the Adam Smith problem. These are the passages that depict human motivation as primarily self-interested, that downplay the importance of benevolence and set Smith up as the champion of the principle that a rising tide or growing economy lifts all boats. You could stress the invisible hand, stress the engine of selfishness, stress the places in which Smith seems to justify the plight of the poor in exchange for the general opulence. On this front, there's perhaps no better place to begin than with Smith's description of the division of labor. Here, Smith makes crystal clear that the division of labor lies principally behind the general opulence that he's describing, that is this topic of his study in The Wealth of Nations. And that it's our tendency to exchange and to specialize that makes us and our societies better off. As Smith puts it, the division of labor from which so many advantages are derived is not originally the effect of any human wisdom, which foresees and intends that general opulence to which it gives occasion. It is the necessary, though very slow and gradual consequence of a certain propensity in human nature, which has in view no such extensive utility, the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another. Or as Smith puts it in a very well-known passage, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, brewer, or baker that we owe our bread, but rather to their self-interest. Here he makes clear that in trade, we, quote, address ourselves not to others' humanity, but to their self-love. Nobody but a beggar, Smith writes with some disdain, chooses to depend chiefly upon the benevolence of his fellow citizens. Though I won't, in the interest of time, dwell on this, it's also worth drawing students' attention to the one place in The Wealth of Nations that Smith refers to the invisible hand by name. Here, Smith says that in pursuing his self-interest, an individual is, quote, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. What's more is that he says that we are led to pursue that end more effectually than when we really intend to promote it, continuing that he has never known much good to be done by those who affected to trade for the public good or the common interest. In seeking our local interests, our own personal interests, that of our family, that of our local community, Smith can seem to suggest we promote ever broader interests. We need not worry too much, he seems to suggest, about being benevolent as long as our institutions are set up to harness self-interest effectively. Early on, and when discussing the Wealth of Nations, I think it can help them to see Smith as defending what Dieter McCloskey calls the bourgeois virtues, virtues that make much of being self-made, of being frugal, and of looking out prudently after our own interests over the long term, even when those interests come at others' expense. On Smith's telling, the virtue of frugality is opposed to the vice of prodigality. Whereas the first tends to benefit everyone, the second can impoverish entire countries. If the prodigality of some, he writes, was not compensated by the frugality of others, the conduct of every prodigal, by feeding the idle with the bread of the industrious, tends not only to beggar himself, but to impoverish his country. If students are bogging down because the Smith material in the Wealth of Nations is too abstract, consider showing them I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So if students are bogging down in an abstract nature of this discussion, it's worth bringing home to them the core phenomenon that Smith is interested in the Wealth of Nations. Something like what you see in the so-called hockey stick graph that shows the remarkable economic growth starting after industrialization, and to really make clear that Smith is interested in understanding the sources of a graph that looks like this. Another thing that you can show them if the Smith stuff in the Wealth of Nations seems quite abstract is a short movie, the thumbnail for which is on the screen here, but I won't spend time showing you, called I Pencil, which makes the mundane pencil, the thing that students use in their exams and so on and so forth, seem to be the stuff of miracles. Or you could show them a video about the so-called $15,000 sandwich, in which a person tries to make a sandwich genuinely from scratch, taking flights to go source materials and so on and so forth. As you help them see what's miraculous in all this, though, I think the really crucial part for the narrative structure that I'm going to be suggesting is a good one for organizing this unit of a class. You don't want to lose sight of the motivational engine of the miracle, our propensity to look out for our own interests, to specialize, and to trade. One of the advantages of structuring this unit in the way that I suggest doing is that it's always good to give students a break after a dense text, and the Wealth of Nations is a very dense text indeed. So after they grapple with some of the ideas in the Wealth of Nations, which I've treated very quickly for the sake of time here, students get an opportunity to relax and unwind with Dickens' great novel, and I think this reads like a bingeable Netflix series by comparison to the Wealth of Nations. Well, Smith emphasizes the productive power of markets. We join Dickens in stinky, smelly Coke Town, a town of machinery and tall chimneys out of which interminable serpents of smoke trail themselves forever and ever, never to be uncoiled. A town, of course, with a stratified population, rich and poor. The differences between the classes loom large in Dickens' story. Dickens is well aware that those who succeed in industrial societies often chalk things up to their possession of the already mentioned bourgeois virtues. On this point, Dickens gives us Bounderby, a self-important parody of himself. So here's the passage where Bounderby's character is introduced. Dickens writes, "He was a rich man, a banker, merchant, manufacturer, and whatnot. A big, loud man with a stare and a metallic laugh. A man made out of a coarse material, which seemed to have been stretched to make so much of him. A man with a great puffed head and forehead, swelled veins in his temples, and such a strained skin to his face that it seemed to hold his eyes open and lift his eyebrows up. A man with a pervading appearance on him of being inflated like a balloon and ready to start. A man who could never sufficiently vaunt himself a self-made man. A man who was always complaining through that brassy speaking trumpet of a voice of his old ignorance and his old poverty. A man who was the bully of humility." And in another representative passage, you see him doing exactly this. So in a conversation with Mrs. Gradgrind, Bounderby says, "I was able to pull through it all, I suppose. Whether I was to do it or not, ma'am, I did it. I pulled through it, though nobody threw me out a rope. Vagabond, errand boy, vagabond, laborer, porter, clerk, chief manager, small partner, Josiah Bounderby of Coketown. These are the antecedents and the culmination. Josiah Bounderby of Coketown learnt his letters from outside the shops, Mrs. Gradgrind, and was first able to tell the time upon a dial plate from studying the steeple clock of St. Giles's Church, London, under the direction of a drunken cripple who was a convicted thief and an incorrigible vagrant. Bounderby's character is to show that the new political economy's morality of frugality, respect for private property, and ambition is incomplete at best, the stuff of gilded vice at worst. You're supposed to laugh at Bounderby, to think that he's ridiculous, that these virtues are overstated in himself, if they're virtues at all. But it is just these virtues, along with a hard-nosed empiricism, that are taught at the school at which Thomas Gradgrind works as superintendent. Gradgrind takes his political economy seriously, so seriously that he names two of his children Malthus, and you guessed it, Adam Smith. His program is a program of uncompromising factfulness, a program that has the novel's moral hero, Sissy Jupe, banging her head against the wall. If Smith emphasizes the gains from trade and the importance of celebrating improvement, things like frugality and making something of oneself, Dickens' Jupe reminds us that improvements can mean little to those left behind. In a great passage that emphasizes the separateness of persons, Sissy tells Gradgrind's daughter Louisa about an embarrassing encounter that she has that day at school, and a didactic conversation with the aptly named Mr. Machocumchild. I am almost ashamed, said Sissy with reluctance, but today, for instance, Mr. Machocumchild was explaining to us about the natural prosperity. National, I think it must have been, observed Louisa. Yes, it was, but isn't it the same? She timidly asked. You'd better say national, as he said so, returned Louisa with her dry reserve. National prosperity. And he said, now, this schoolroom is a nation, and in this nation there are 50 millions of money. Isn't this a prosperous nation? Girl number 20, isn't this a prosperous nation? And ain't you in a thriving state? What did you say? Asked Louisa. What did you say? Asked Louisa. Miss Louisa, I said I didn't know. I thought I couldn't know whether it was a prosperous nation or not, and whether I was in a thriving state or not, unless I knew who had got the money and whether any of it was mine. But that had nothing to do with it. It was not in the figures at all, said Sissy, wiping her eyes. That was a great mistake of yours, observed Louisa. Yes, Miss Louisa, I know it was now. Then Mr. Machocumchild said he would try me again. And he said, this schoolroom is an immense town, and in it there are 1 million of inhabitants, and only 5 and 20 are starved to death in the streets in the course of a year. What is your remark on that proportion? And my remark was, for I couldn't think of a better one, that I thought it must be just as hard upon those who were starved, whether the others were 1 million or 1 million. And that was wrong too. Of course it was. Then Mr. Machocumchild said that he would try me once more. And he said, here are the stutterings. Statistics, said Louisa. Yes, Miss Louisa, they always remind me of stutterings. And that's another of my mistakes, of accidents upon the sea. And I find that in a given time, 100,000 persons went to sea on long voyages, and only 500 of them were drowned or burned to death. What is the percentage? And I said, Miss, here Sissy fairly sobbed, as confessing with extreme contrition to her greatest error. I said it was nothing. Nothing, Sissy? Nothing, miss, to the relations and friends of the people who were killed. I shall never learn, said Sissy. Thus, while Gradgrind is an enthusiast for the Smithian political economy, it comes out clearly and often that Dickens is considerably more skeptical. What Smith's talk of the wealth of nations misses is that though the national prosperity might be a very fine thing, it doesn't do much good to those who don't take part, the poor. This is all lost on Gradgrind, who brings his children up to be utilitarian calculators, seeking nothing other than their rational advantage in the nations, and nothing less than the flight of fancy. When Bounderby, pretentious and self-important as he is, lights upon Gradgrind's daughter Louisa as a potential wife, Gradgrind's penchant for cost-benefit analysis comes through clearly. She should take Bounderby's hand in marriage. He has, after all, every external that one could ever prize in a mate, and nothing internal, of course, could matter. While never the site of passion, things in their relationship, Louisa's and Bounderby's, fall apart as Harthouse, the son of a parliamentarian, begins to court her. At the same time, Gradgrind's son falls into a life of crime, also under the spell of Harthouse. And so Gradgrind's system, a word that I've chosen carefully and to which I'll return at the end, of education, begins to come crashing down around him. Where it should have had its most totalizing beneficial effects close to home, both Gradgrind children are shown to lack the traits of character needed for survival as creatures, not merely rational, but also sentimental. Another word carefully chosen. For the whelp, Tom Gradgrind Jr., the issue is that the pursuit of his own self-interest begins to require not merely the cooperation of others, but also their stuff. His appetite for gambling and expensive tobacco overwhelms his capacity for self-restraint. His prodigality has him stealing his own things from Bounderby's bank and reporting those things stolen by another for insurance purposes. For Louisa, her sentiments are so inadequately trained that she knows not what to do in the face of genuinely romantic feeling, and comes to regard her marriage, never enthusiastically entered into, as a kind of prison. Having been educated to expect feelings and other flights of fancy were unimportant, Louisa is led to underestimate their raw power and their tendency to overwhelm when not trained and reflected upon, in a word, when stifled. If Gradgrind has faced doubts about his system before from his wife and from others in the community, he's never let them hit home. Now he has no choice. After the hapless Stephen Blackpool is exonerated after having been accused of young Tom's crimes, Gradgrind finds that Tom has fled and that he has been tracked by an ambitious bank employee, Bitzer. Trained by Gradgrind himself to ignore mushy feelings like sympathy, Bitzer is deaf to Gradgrind's plea to help him, intent on bettering himself instead by turning young Tom into Bounderby in hopes for professional advancement. In confronting Bitzer, Gradgrind says, "Bitzer, have you no heart?" "The circulation, sir," returned Bitzer, smiling at the oddity of the question, "couldn't be carried on without one. No man, sir, acquainted with the facts established by Harvey relating to the circulation of the blood can doubt that I have a heart." "Is it accessible," cried Mr. Gradgrind, "to any compassionate influence?" Ironic for him to be asking, of course. "It is accessible to reason, sir," returned the excellent young man, "and to nothing else." "What motive, even what motive in reason, can you have for preventing the escape of this wretched youth?" said Mr. Gradgrind, "and crushing his miserable father." "Sir," returned Bitzer in a very businesslike and logical manner, "since you ask me what motive I have in reason for taking young Mr. Tom back to Coketown, it is only reasonable to let you know. I have suspected young Tom of this bank robbery from the first. I had my eye upon him before that time, for I knew his ways. I have kept my observations to myself, but I have made them. And I have got ample proofs against him now, besides his running away, and besides his own confession, which I was just in time to overhear. I had the pleasure of watching your house yesterday morning and following you here. I am going to take young Mr. Tom back to Coketown in order to deliver him over to Mr. Bounderby. Sir, I have no doubt whatever that Mr. Bounderby will then promote me to young Mr. Tom's situation. And I wish to have his situation, sir, for it will be a rise to me and will do me good." "If this is solely a question of self-interest with you," Mr. Gradgrind began. "I beg your pardon for interrupting you, sir," returned Bitzer, "but I am sure you know that the whole social system is a question of self-interest. What you must always appeal to is a person's self-interest. It's your only hold. We are so constituted. I was brought up in that catechism when I was very young, sir, as you well know." "What sum of money," said Mr. Gradgrind, "will you set against your expected promotion?" "Thank you, sir," returned Bitzer, "for hinting at the proposal, but I will not set any sum against it. Knowing that your clear head would propose that alternative, I have gone over the calculations in my mind. I find that to compound a felony, even on very high terms indeed, would not be as safe and good for me as my improved prospects in the bank. And so Gradgrind is finally forced to see the error of his ways and the weaknesses in his system. He is forced, in language that looks like it could have been Smith's own, to confront the poverty of a system in which all we are to one another is useful, and in which our only appeal is to another person's advantage. In this last scene, Gradgrind shows himself to be susceptible to the need for compassion, and he dismays in failing to find it. Before turning finally to Smith's theory of moral sentiments, it's worth noting briefly that the novel concludes with Dickens adopting the role of moralist. Dear reader, it rests with you and me, Dickens writes, whether we prize the plainest national prosperity figures at the expense of our common humanity, or if instead we choose to beautify our lives of machinery and reality with those imaginative graces and delight, without which the heart of infancy will wither up, the sturdiest physical manhood will be morally stark death. Having now spent a bunch of time talking about Dickens' critique of Smithian political economy, showing how caught up in the crosshairs Smith's philosophy, stated by Smith himself, seems to be, the very first paragraph of the theory of moral sentiments should jump off the page for just the same reason that it has jumped off the page to well-educated readers of the text for centuries: Smith's apparent inconsistency. How could the same person who stressed the selfishness as a driver of economic growth and a source of exchange and motivation, the same writer who has told us indeed how little we can expect when we appeal to one another's benevolence, have also developed an entire moral theory grounded in sympathy? Why would he begin his treatise on moral theory with the claim that, quote, how selfish soever man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render their happiness necessary to him? Why would he insist that, quote, to feel much for others and little for ourselves, that to restrain our selfish and to indulge our benevolent affections constitutes the perfection of human nature? What's more, and this is important, is that it's not merely that Smith is now extolling the virtues of other regard in this book, siding with moralists against maybe himself. It's that he's also extremely critical of wealth. Indeed, he notes in the passage currently on the screen that we have a perverse tendency to overvalue wealth and to see it as worthy of respect and admiration, and those who have it as worthy of respect and admiration. We might think the wealthy tend to be virtuous and hold the poor in contempt, when nothing of the sort is true. When discussing a passage like this, I think it's really helpful to have your students think back on Bounderby and his assumptions about Stephen Blackpool. Weren't those grounded largely in his unfortunate poverty, ignoring his character? Have them reflect on why, until the very end of the novel, young Tom is never suspected. Doesn't that have more to do with Tom's situation than it does with Tom's character, the viciousness of which his sister picks up on quite early? Smith expresses here sympathy with moralists who complain about these tendencies to acquire wealth. He doesn't endorse them. What's more is that Smith laments when people ruin themselves by laying out money on trinkets of frivolous utility. This leads him into perhaps my favorite passage in the entire book, what scholars call the parable of the poor man's son. Normally, by the way, I would have students read out loud many of these passages, but for the sake of time, I'll spare you any such exercise here. The important thing to note is that Smith and Dickens seem to be, to a much more substantial degree, in agreement with one another on the character of the good life than you might have otherwise thought. It is, after all, in its anger that heaven visits the poor man's son with ambition, finding the cottage of his father too small for his accommodation. The poor man's son seeks convenience, and to obtain it, he, quote, submits in the first month of his application to more fatigue of body and more uneasiness of mind than he could have suffered through the whole of his life from the want of them. He studies to distinguish himself in some laborious profession. With the most unrelenting industry, he labors night and day to acquire talents superior to his competitors. He endeavors next to bring those talents into public view, and with equal assiduity solicits every opportunity of employment. For this purpose, he makes his court to all mankind. He serves those whom he hates and is obsequious to those whom he despises. In all of this, Smith tells us, the poor man's son sacrifices, quote, a real tranquility that is at all times in his power. It is only, quote, in the last dregs of life, his body wasted with toil and diseases, his mind galled and ruffled by the memory of 1,000 injuries and disappointments, that he begins at last to find that wealth and greatness themselves are mere trinkets of frivolous utility, more troublesome to the person who carries them about with him than all the advantages they can afford him are commodious. The poor man's son is laboring under an illusion to which many of us are susceptible, that wealth and greatness are grand and beautiful and noble, and above all, worth the cost of admission. Well then, why study the wealth of nations? Are we now to read Smith's famous treatise on economics as a manual instructing us what not to do? Did Smith merely have a change of heart for the worse after he published the words that we've just reflected upon in the theory of moral sentiments? On the contrary, Smith continued to think of himself primarily as a moral philosopher, not a political economist, and of theory of moral sentiments as his greatest work. He continued to work on it until he died in 1790, and he released 6 editions during his lifetime. This was something he cared about a lot through the end, well after he published The Wealth of Nations. What Smith says in the next passage on the screen that we'll talk about, I think, provides not only the clue to the answer regarding the so-called Adam Smith problem, but also the basis for a crucial distinction in Smith's thought, the distinction between the system of nature and the system of philosophy. To see this, notice that of our natural tendency to admire and pursue wealth, Smith says, it is well that nature imposes upon us in this manner. It is this deception which rouses and keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind. It is this which first prompted them to cultivate the ground, to build houses, to found cities and commonwealths, and to invent and improve all the sciences and arts which ennoble and embellish human life. As to those who come to own great tracts of land, the capacity of their stomachs bear no proportion to the immensity of their desires. The rest of the plenty that our ambition-fueled economies redounds to those who, quote, fit up the palace in which this little is to be consumed, among those who provide and keep in order all the different baubles and trinkets which are employed in the economy of greatness. In this way, those who seek and realize wealth are, quote, led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions. Central claim of The Wealth of Nations appearing here in the theory of moral sentiments. So although it is bad for us as individuals to pursue wealth and greatness, it is good that we are not too good at doing what is good for us. It is, after all, this tendency to be bad at doing what's good for us that makes prosperity possible and is a big part of what has enabled some of our nations, some of our economies to become famine-proof. The system of philosophy teaches us to care about the right things, provided we want to live good lives and dedicate ourselves to them. The system of nature, by contrast, imposes on us to value things that might lead to the ruin of good lives, but that have significant positive externalities for broader society. In a passage we haven't talked about yet, Dickens makes an appeal to the utilitarian economists. He likely has in mind Bentham as well as Smith. And what he says basically is that you yourselves, utilitarian economists, ought to care about the poor because they threaten you as wolves if their lives are not adequately adorned with the ornament of fancies and affectations. Here we can imagine Smith saying to Dickens, maybe so, but that wouldn't be the chief reason to ensure that people are able to cultivate proper sympathy and an interest in the arts and humanities. The reason to cultivate these human capacities is that they embellish and ennoble human life and are, in the end, the stuff that a genuinely choice-worthy life is made up of. What becomes of education? It should by now be clear that Gradgrind will not find much support for his system of education in Smith. Gradgrind's system purports to teach people to value more what they are already inclined to value, what nature imposes upon us all to value. Should we then pursue systems of education that teach students to scorn wealth and trinkets for the sake of the system of philosophy? I want to suggest not obviously. Smith, after all, has few kind things to say about the man of system, who is often, quote, so enamored with the supposed beauty of his own ideal plan of government that he cannot suffer the smallest deviation from any part of it, who goes on to establish it completely in all its parts without any regard either to the great interests or the strong prejudices which may oppose it. The man of system on Smith's telling imagines that he can, quote, arrange the different members of a great society with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces upon a chessboard. He does not consider that the pieces have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon them, but that in the great chessboard of human society, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own. There is thus a suggestion in Smith that Gradgrind's problem was only partially that he taught as a sufficient philosophy a mere trick of nature. A perhaps bigger failing of Gradgrind's approach to education is that he thought he could fashion human beings as from clay. He takes his bitter lesson in the worst thing a parent can undergo, the misery, suffering, and ruin of his children at his own hand. Louisa and Tom Jr., Malthus and Adam Smith have each of them their own principles of motion. An education that ignores that fact and attempts to graft onto them foreign principles is bound to be a ruin of its own. All of this narrative, I think you can bring out through well-organized class discussions. I think you can run incredibly rich conversations about the place of ambition in the good life, questions about whether well-being or resources matter fundamentally in distributive justice, and whether those who have a lot externally could sometimes be on the losing end in terms of what matters. As for activities, while teaching the Wealth of Nations, you can have students play a simple trading game in which each student is given a cheap item, $1 to $5 each. So I like to get a variety of things, drinks, a can of tuna or cat food or something like that that's likely to be undesirable next to candy and soft drinks and things of that nature. And then what you do is you begin by having them rate their satisfaction with what they've been given, and you record the sum of the total on the board. You give them a trading period and have them make one trade, have them rate their satisfaction again, record the sum, allow them to trade again, record the sum again. The result invariably is that net welfare massively increases after trade, even for those who weren't happy with their initial allocation. The person who gets the cat food or the tuna is usually miserable at first, but then somebody who has a cat or needs lunch that day gets it and they're thrilled to have it. I think those are some things that you can do, especially in the context of Wealth of Nations, to make it a little bit more fun and easy to see the points that Smith's making. But I also think that the texts lend themselves really well to more formal discussion models like debates. So in this context, you can have them debate things like commodification. So does allowing certain things to be bought and sold corrupt our moral sentiments? Does Smith's general lessons about markets extend also to controversial markets and things like sex, parenthood, or organs? You'd also have students debate the merits of ethical capitalism. When companies do attempt to trade for the common good, a prospect that Smith treats skeptically in The Wealth of Nations, are they actually achieving some good? What should we think about so-called ethical consumerism? I think it would also be great fun to have students debate whether liberal education Education which seeks to help students learn not what to think, but rather how to think is a consistent ideal, or whether it winds up contradictory. And I think it would also, especially in the context of lots of stuff going on that Andy alluded to in the world that is, affecting people's classrooms in various respects, to think about the role of instructors' personal philosophies in instruction. So Gradgrind obviously takes it to be his job to instill in his students his values. Is that what students are seeking in education? And is that what instructors should be seeking to provide? In terms of assignments, I like the idea of having students write a dialogue between Smith and Dickens. What would Smith say about the way his system is portrayed in Dickens' novel? Would he wind up agreeing on any points? What would Dickens say in turn? Would he end up admitting that Hard Times is nothing more really than a warning against reading The Wealth of Nations without also reading The Theory of Moral Sentiments? Or would Dickens have more to say, even confronting a more nuanced Smith? Through the more familiar form of dialogue and having been prepared, students can address the old scholarly question of the Smith problem without the straitjacket of scholarly conventions. I think I'm at or over time, so I'll stop there, and looking forward to a really good discussion. Thanks for your attention.
Well, thank you so much for that, Professor Messina. So folks, you'll see that there's a Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And so you should feel free to put your questions for Professor Messina there. And then just as a reminder, the webinar portion, the workshop portion with Professor Messina will conclude at 1:30 Eastern, and from 1:30 to 2 o'clock, there's an optional Q&A for those who have questions about the grant application process. Andy DeBlanco and I will stay on to respond to those questions.
Lonnie, maybe I can make, this is not really a question, but I thought I would just ventilate a thought that was occurring to me while listening to JP, while others are thinking of what they might want to put in the Q&A. Something that strikes me, and I guess it's connected to my comment earlier that neither Smith nor Dickens is a writer whom students are likely to encounter very often these days. So they're going to come to these writers, as they come to many writers, as alien, strange, antiquated, irrelevant, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that really struck me most forcefully in your remarks, JP, is how many issues are raised here that are current and urgent in the lives of our students. I mean, just enumerate a couple of them. Is it, or is it not true that energetic, relentless pursuit of, Smith would have it, trinkets or wealth, does that lead to happiness or not? What's the relationship between that and happiness? On the dialogue about statistics in the Dickens novel, what are we supposed to conclude when we read that only 1% of people have this disease, or the number of fatalities in this war or that accident is relatively small compared to the overall population? How are we supposed to think about something like that? That it means it's okay, or that we're not thinking hard enough about the people who are on the wrong side of the statistics? Or the most striking, since you're going to be teaching Cornerstone in a business school, and many of our colleagues teach students who are very interested in business, the Smith's comment that he's never seen much benefit to trading for the public good, right? I mean, how are we supposed to think about, say, socially conscious investing versus profit maximizing investing? So those are just a few, but it's very encouraging to me to hear you talk about these texts the way you did, because I don't think it would be that hard to get students pretty, I don't know if excited is the right word, but pretty focused on them if you highlight those kinds of questions, particularly since it's not clear what the answers are, even to Smith himself, as you point out. So anyway, I just wanted to put that out there as a reaction to what you're saying.
Yeah, no, that seems exactly right to me. I mean, I think that they're really exciting texts with a lot there that's relevant to talk about today. So the debate idea on conscious consumerism or conscience-based investing, I think is super interesting. You have a lot of like index funds that are designed to target ethically conscious firms, and students are interested in like apps that direct them to those kinds of things and that can help evaluate what merits companies' inclusion on that list and so on and so forth. So I think they're hyper relevant questions. And really interesting for a business ethics context. So one of the things that gets taught in the second course of the sequence is Milton Friedman's essay in the New York Times, where he argues basically that the ethical obligation of business is to pursue profit. And so foregrounding in the first sequence of our course, that sort of issue is really quite important. But yeah, I mean, I sign on to all of that. I think that there's tons here that can get students, and I would even say excited about these texts.
Right, and one other comment, if you'll indulge me. I mean, you did an elegant reconciliation of the two Smiths, but the fact remains that at first blush, at least, it would appear that Smith is contradicting himself and can't make up his mind about what he thinks about selfishly motivated actions versus altruistically motivated actions. And that too is something that I suspect students could relate to, because none of us know how to feel about that question. How far should we go for ourselves, and how far should we go for others, and how do you put the two things together? So anyway, really rich texts, and I'm glad you brought them to us today.
Yeah, and one contemporary debate that touches on that specifically is the effective altruism movement, which has as a subcomponent a sort of 80,000 hours project, which is designed to help students think about how most effectively to think of their careers in terms of difference making for others. And so I think like that's another point where this has been in the news because of Sam Bankman-Fried. You can kind of seize on that popular discourse to get students excited about talking about questions like who's your career for, what should you be seeking in a career, and things of that nature that are just like the stuff of the college existential crisis, really. And it's always good to seize upon that somewhat and to try to help provide resources for thinking, yeah, there's something very human about what you're going through right now. And someone as smart as Smith clearly struggled throughout his career with this stuff.
Well, along those lines, GPU alluded to how, I mean, Adam Smith is probably most associated with Wealth of Nations, and yet the work that he turned to over and over again throughout his career, up until the end of his life, was theory of moral sentiments. I just thought it was really interesting that, like, I think the first edition of theory came out before the Wealth of Nations.
That's right, in the 50s, 1750s, 1759, I think. And then Wealth was in the 80s, I believe, or 1776, actually. It was 1776, and then the last edition was published after Smith died.
So could you say more about like what was he iterating on?
There's a scholarly literature about the various different changes that the text undergoes. So he does a number of different things. He's focused a lot in the last edition on something that I didn't talk at all about, but I think is like, you can have really good conversations about this too with students pertaining to the character of Bounderby. Like, yeah, Smith does talk a lot about virtues of self-command, for instance, and that's something that he's working on a lot in the final editions of the book. And so, he's clearly committed to a conception of virtue that makes a lot of self-command and a lot of controlling yourself and your passions and making sure your sentiments are attuned to the conditions of their propriety. And so I think that, like, I don't know for an undergraduate population if going through the editions would be too much or too tedious or academic an exercise, but certainly, like, you've given me a nice opportunity to at least say, like, the stuff on self-command and universal benevolence and how those things relate is really rich and interesting in Smith. So yeah, I think think there's a lot of interest there.
So we have some interesting questions from colleagues in the audience. One question is, how would you sort of like the practicalities of teaching these very substantive texts? Would you teach the works in their entirety? Would you choose excerpts? And if you choose,
this is the works in their entire, just the Smith works in their entirety, right? You can't, I don't think, without just dedicating an entire class to Smith, even that, like, and a lot of the Wealth of Nations stuff is dry and more difficult to motivate. So I actually do have already prepared excerpts in like a sort of schedule that I'd be happy to share if you email me. Off the top of my head, I don't remember how exactly I divide things up, but I have specific passages that I have them read that go far beyond the excerpts that we talk about today. And I would think about doing this over the course of 6 or 7 weeks. Probably you could get it down to 3 or 4, I think, if you needed to, by making some judicious cuts. But and it also depends a bit on whether you meet 2 or 3 days a week. That's a variable that would make it easier to get more of it done, I think, if you were doing 3 days a week.
And then for the Dickens, for a full-length novel, would you assign the novel in its entirety?
Yeah, and it's breezy. I mean, compared to a lot of novels that they read, I don't think it's super difficult. The prose is relatively familiar, even where it's not. The edition that we've chosen to assign, which is this Penguin Classics edition, has a ton of explanations concerning Dickens's verbiage where it becomes maybe unfamiliar or might serve a literary purpose. So yeah, having them read the complete novel is something that I would recommend. Also, like, it's really hard to break up a novel justifiably. There's a plot, there's a beautiful love story in the middle of it that is worth reflecting on and discussing, irrespective of what you might want to do with this novel relating to Smith. And it has lots of interesting parts that like you would want to draw out, keeping in mind the stuff that you want to talk about with Smith and making sure that you hit on those points, but also touching on other things that might not be pertinent to that discussion.
Could I make one other quick comment on this point? First of all, I was thinking just what you said. I think the excerpts you used from Smith were extremely effective. And my reaction, I don't know how others felt, you could have a whole class about any one of them, right? And you really don't, I mean, as a reminder, a Cornerstone course is not about turning undergraduates into experts on Adam Smith or any other writer. It's about engaging them with ideas. And you did that with just a very small number of selections from this complex text. With the Dickens, I think you're right. It's harder to get somewhere with excerpts from a novel. And that's a challenge. It can be done maybe a little bit, but short novels are going to work better if they read the whole thing. So I just, as a practical matter, wanted to put that out there. The main point, though, is that you don't have to be intimidated by a fat book like the Adam Smith. If you find the meat of it and put it in front of students, you can get a lot of mileage out of that.
Yeah, agreed. And we actually we asked students to buy this, which is the Essential Adam Smith. And it has really great excerpts of both theory and Wealth of Nations, along with some other stuff from Smith. And so I think like that's a little less intimidating to approach. A lot of the work has been done for you. The editor does a good job sort of pointing out what's important about various selections from the works. So it's a good instructional resource if you're coming to these texts for the first time since you studied them maybe yourself many years ago.
Well, we have an interesting question from a colleague who uses Bellamy's Looking Backward for a student exercise where they debate the merits of an ideal society. And so she is curious about, thoughts about using that text, pairing it with Smith. I mean, what are your thoughts on sort of other possible textual pairings?
So I'll reveal that I am not well read. I haven't read the Bellamy text, but the question of the nature of an ideal society and the desirability of an ideal society, certainly something that comes out in Smith. So he's interested in something called what he calls the Great Society, and realizing it. And there's a respect in which it's utopian, but it's not utopian in the sense that More's utopia is utopian, where it's like all planned out. It's rather a society that makes room for what later theorists would call the emergence of spontaneous orders, which emerge from the uncoordinated but intentional behavior of individuals and groups seeking their enlightened self-interest. And so, yeah, I mean, I think passages like the passage we looked at about the man of system, and other passages in which Smith is interested in institutions, not because they themselves guarantee or secure certain goods, but because they're likely to be incentive compatible and serve as the conditions for the realization of those goods, I think it's a really great text, either parts of the Theory of Moral Sentiments or parts of The Wealth of Nations, to pair with discussions. And in fact, I deleted it for reasons of time, but one of the discussion topics and debate topics that I think is just supernatural here is the role of utopias in political thinking, political and economic thinking, the role of ideal planning and rational planning in creating a good society. So I think it's a great question. Not knowing the Bellamy obviously limits my ability to remark, but I would think that you would find plenty here to pair with a text where those themes come up centrally.
Well, speaking of teaching exercises, the trading game that you described, it just seemed like a really fun exercise. And I was just thinking, in terms of just like what's the time allocation, for.
Yeah. So it doesn't take long as you can. So you have them sum up their well-being in easily countable increments. So rated, on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 5 or something. You give them 60 seconds to make each trade. So there's something like, if you're having them do 2 trades, that's something like 2 minutes there, maybe a minute for distributing the things. And then, there's some accounting that might take a minute or 2, but you can do it in 10, 15 minutes and then have the discussion about how it relates to Smith. This sort of propensity to exchange is like the source of opulence. Look, you guys just became more opulent. And you didn't do anything except like trade some stuff that you didn't really want for some stuff that you did really want.
Well, we have a nice question on a point that you had made, GP, in your talk from your Purdue colleague, Melinda. So,
no.
So Melinda asks, is the man of system necessarily, in Dickens, necessarily Bentham, Smith, or Malthus? Is it possible it could also be a more radical ideologue?
So in Smith, I think of, I used, perhaps quickly and without too much support, Smith's passage in on the man of system to say, look, he's going to be not super happy with Gradgrind's educational system because of what that entails and how he seems to treat human beings as just to be moved about according to some abstract system. That's not probably who Smith has in mind when he's writing about the man of system. He probably has in mind radical planners, people like who want to large scale reorganize society, utopian thinkers, people who are more radical in their social designs. So I was being a little opportunistic there as a point to just say, like, it's not just what Gradgrind teaches, but how he teaches and how he thinks about teaching that's wrong. But Smith's point is the political economy point that, the rational planner is not, despite the beauty of his designs, well positioned to impose it on a society that might not like it very much or see its beauty. That seems to be his real target, Melinda. But thanks for the question. I was playing a little fast and loose there.
One question from a colleague in the audience. Do you ever, related to the GDP chart that you had shared at the top of the workshop, do you ever introduce students to alternatives to GDP as measures of economic health, like human development indexes?
Yeah. So sorry for interrupting. Yeah. I mean, I again having not taught these texts, but when I teach things like the GDP growth and things of that nature, yeah, I think it's important to think of other metrics of human well-being, things like the capabilities approach that Nussbaum and Sen have come up with for thinking through when a society is realizing just distribution of resources. I think that some of that stuff ends up being a little bit anachronistic, even thinking about GDP exactly is anachronistic to Smith. But yeah, it's just a sort of motivating device. Another thing that you can show that our world in data produces is like drastic reductions in rates of extreme poverty. And I think like for whatever reason, the contemporary undergraduate comes to us deeply pessimistic about the world. And so they can see Smith talking about opulence as being woefully sort of naive about the reality that we have a world in which the rich are always getting richer and the poor are always getting poorer. So that's another sort of chart that you can bring in to at least help them think about respects in which things might not be as bad as they're given to thinking that they are. But yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, thinking about gross domestic product versus per capita median income, thinking about things like the Gini coefficient, thinking about levels of equality and inequality of goods. Those are also really great. I mean, depending on how you wanted to structure the class, whether you wanted to use theory of moral sentiments or focus more on wealth of nations type stuff, great topics for discussion, especially if you wanted to zoom in on the Sissy Jupe thing. What she's really after there is that Smith seems to be blind to distributive questions. Like he seems to be about just noticing whether there have been net changes in terms of goods and services for people that are in the positive direction, ignoring how questions about how that's distributed, that wealth is distributed. And so I think like there is, if you wanted to bring in supplementary materials, especially, a lot that you can make students live to in terms of debates about human well-being and how to measure it and whether it can be measured and things like that and how it should be distributed.